for our hearing on strengthening the U.S.-Africa trade investment relationships. We really appreciate your joining us today. We've got some great witnesses and some fascinating things to discuss. But before we turn to that, I want to remind members, as if we need a reminder, of the procedures to help us navigate the virtual hearing. Consistent with regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, members and witnesses must have their cameras on when present in the hearing. If you need to step away from the proceedings, turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out. Third, we will dispense with our practice of observing the Gibbons rule and instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between the minority and majority and beginning with the members of the Trade Subcommittee. I thank everybody for your continued patience as we navigate the technology and other challenges in serving our country in this time of great need. I would like to turn now to the topic of the hearing, strengthening the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationships. Today's hearing is the next step in the committee's ongoing work in the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. We met with the President of Kenya, as well as Kenya's ambassador to the United States, to discuss trade matters. Recently, we led congressional engagement with African trade ministers during this year's AGOA Forum. I would like to begin by noting that our committee is committed to the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. And you'll hear from our distinguished ranking member that this is a bipartisan and deeply felt commitment. Strengthening our trade relationship with Africa is bipartisan support, in part because of our longstanding social, cultural, and political ties with the African continent. As President Obama noted when he spoke before the African Union in 2015, Africa and its people helped shape America and allowed it to become the great nation that it is. But we're all aware of the vestiges of colonialism that has stifled development in Africa and haunts it to this day. This is why we're committed to ensuring that our trade and investment policies spur inclusive and durable economic development, both in Africa and the United States. We want to make sure that the benefits of trade and the investments flow to everyone, not a select few, regardless of their station in life. This committee has been a driver when it comes to advancing and thinking creatively about trade policy with the African continent. AGOA, the cornerstone of American economic engagement with the Sub-Saharan Africa, is a product of this committee. But what you're going to hear today from our witnesses, that there are limitations. AGOA has been helpful, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. We need to make sure that we're taking advantage of the opportunities and the challenges that we face with Africa. Africa is perhaps over the next decade the source of greatest economic opportunity, while it continues to be troubled with issues of corruption and development has been a challenge, to say the very least. Our activities with Congress, you'll hear from our witnesses, has been somewhat limited. It is clear that a bipartisan failure to place a high priority on Africa has been problematic. We're looking at other nations having much greater presence, much greater investment, and we have tended to lag behind. One of the things I hope we can discuss as a committee is the extent to which we want to place a higher priority on this relationship. Are we willing to make investments in terms of trade, in terms of resources, in terms of investment, and in terms of the United States presence? I think it's an open question. But given the fact that it is fast growing, it is young, it is challenging, and the problems of Africa are not limited to just Africa. There's instability in the course of some countries, and there are tremendous environmental challenges, as those of us who just returned from Glasgow can attest. and every member of the subcommittee is aware of this. So I am hopeful that we can spend some time today thinking hard about what we want to do to change the priority that attaches to sub-Saharan Africa from this committee and with Congress itself. And with that, I would turn to our distinguished ranking member, Vern Buchanan, who's been in every country in Africa on multiple times, who comes to us with a voice of experience and great compassion for the continent.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer. Thanks for your leadership. This is a huge issue. Just you think about Africa has over 1 billion people. The Chinese are very active and engaged in that part of the world. I've seen it over the last 20, 30 years. They're making investments. There's a lot of concern about where that relationship is. I also want to thank our distinguished witnesses for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Africa's rise over the past 20 years is astounding in terms of GDP, as it more than doubled. Africa is digitizing faster than most parts of the world, and Africa's middle class is growing quickly. However, as the chairman mentioned, the challenges COVID-19 pandemic has brought unprecedented disruption in Africa's economy. In fact, the continent is currently experiencing its first recession in 25 years. We believe that deeper economic engagement with the United States will allow Africa to emerge from a pandemic stronger than ever. For the past 20 years, AGOA has been a core of U.S. trade and investment policy in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has benefited tremendously from AGOA, but we must do more to promote utilization of the program as well as diversification of Africa's exports under it. I frequently hear from our African partners that the region needs more U.S. investment, and I agree. I strongly support AGOA, but a unilateral preference program is sufficient to achieve the objectives of increased investment. The EU has supported strategic investments throughout the continent, though its economic partnership agreement. China has supported strategic investments in Africa through its Belt and Road Initiative, and they're very active and engaged, as I mentioned earlier. Since we enacted AGOA in 2000, Congress has directed the executive branch to seek negotiation of reciprocal trade agreements in the region, and I think there's a renewed urgency to do that today. I believe we can design a model trade agreement in sub-Saharan Africa that supports rather than undermines the existing regional economic integration initiative like the African Continent Free Trade Agreement. I welcome insight from our panelists on these important issues. The Trump administration took the right first step by launching the negotiation of a free trade agreement with Kenya. I've had the opportunity to be in Kenya in the 80s, and I've seen the progress over the last 40 years. I look forward from hearing from our Ambassador Mahoney and other witnesses today about that initiative. The Biden administration must take concrete steps towards achieving the same goal in advance of our conversations about the terms of AGOA's renewal in 2025. Africa's economy recovery depends on it. A critical step is engaging the Congress to develop a modernized Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, so that the administration has the ability to negotiate and implement ambitious new trade agreements, including with Kenya and other key partners in Africa. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dealing with this critical. Great. We'll next hear from our witnesses. Our first witness is Flory Lezar, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Corporate Council on Africa. Our second witness is Whitney Schneidman, Senior Advisor for Africa at Covington and Burling. And the third witness is Rosa Whitaker, President and Chief Executive Officer with the Whitaker Group. And our fourth witness is an old friend from the committee, C.J. Mahoney, Deputy General Counsel with Microsoft. Each of your statements will be part of the record in its entirety. It would be helpful if you would summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. Keep your eye on the clock, and it's already pinned to your screen. If you go over time, I'll try and gently remind you, because we want to make sure that there's ample time for each of our committee members to participate. Ms. Lezar?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan. And I'd like to thank all of the Subcommittee on Trade of the House Ways and Means Committee for the invitation to speak today at this important hearing. I'm Flory Lazier, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, which is the only U.S. trade association solely focused on expanding trade and investment between the United States and Africa.
And if I may just interrupt for a moment, I'd note that the Washington International Trade Association recently recognized your contributions over your career advancing U.S. trade relationship with Africa, and congratulate you on receiving the Lighthouse Award.
Thank you so much, sir.
Have that on the table. Congratulations and welcome again.
Thank you so much, sir. It was such an honor. So this is the right time to look at how we can strengthen the U.S. trade and investment relationship with Africa. Countries on the continent are still grappling with the challenges of the COVID pandemic, but are beginning to plan for post-pandemic recovery, create jobs, capture shifts in global supply chains, and attract investment. African leaders have been crystal clear in calling for more American investment in key sectors, including digital trade, manufacturing, finance, and health, where Africa will become the second largest health market in 10 years, behind only the US. The United States is at an important crossroads in its Africa policy. Since its enactment in 2000, AGOA has been the cornerstone of US economic policy towards Africa. It is now set to expire in 2025. Africa has become much more sophisticated and better integrated globally since 2000. And Africa is now in the process of completing the first phase of creating the world's largest unified market through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or AFCFTA. The United States would best serve its own interests by recognizing the progress Africa has made and put in place policies that will allow our companies to mutually grow the US and African economies. Now, what does that mean in practice? Rather than choosing between AGOA, free trade agreements, or AFCFTA, we should adopt a much more nuanced policy that recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to Africa. It may make sense for unilateral preferences for certain African nations to continue under AGOA, while we go beyond AGOA in developing mutually beneficial reciprocal trade agreements with others, like Kenya. Regardless of what other approaches the United States adopts, U.S. support for AFCFTA should be a critical component for U.S. economic engagement with Africa, and nothing we do should undermine this important African process. There's no conflict in doing these while at the same time continuing the U.S.-Kenya FTA discussions and establishing a model for other African countries. The USG has the opportunity to negotiate a trade agreement that doesn't merely take as a given the US gold standard FTA provisions, but is open to an FTA model that makes sense for the US and its African partners. It's worthwhile to look at what has worked in other US trade agreements over time and consider adapting some things there, and also adapting and taking on entirely new approaches. While the U.S. has several options to consider, companies and African countries have made it clear that the lack of clarity about the future direction of U.S. policy is becoming a significant barrier to attracting new investment. It makes little sense for companies to invest in projects to utilize AGOA access if that will end in less than 4 years. Another reason for urgency is one which Representative Buchanan mentioned. Our competitors are ahead of us in terms of developing their potential for two-way trade and investment with Africa. Europe, in particular, has concluded economic partnership agreements, and Kenya has recently concluded a trade agreement with the UK Other African countries like Mauritius and South Africa are concluding agreements with China, the European Union, EFTA, and others. In many ways, a clearer strategy for a trade and investment partnership with Africa is the best way for the US government and Congress to support US companies as they compete with a growing range of international rivals. CCA looks forward to the opportunity to work with members here today and many others to develop the kind of multifaceted approach that will grow and enhance the US-Africa economic relationship. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today at this hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Schneidman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you and the subcommittee for inviting me to speak at this important hearing today. I'm Whitney Schneidman, Senior Advisor for Africa at Covington and Burling, and Chair of the firm's Africa practice. The views expressed today are my own and do not reflect the views of any organization. I've been involved with Africa for nearly 5 decades. I have a master's degree from the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, a PhD from the University of Southern California, and I have served in the State Department twice, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President Clinton. For the last 20 years, I've worked with many companies, mostly American, in more than 30 African countries. Mr. Chairman, the United States is increasingly isolated from the African market. In the past decade, bilateral trade between the United States and Africa has fallen more than 60%, from $113 billion to $44 billion. Direct investment from the United States into Africa has declined by a third in just 7 years, from a peak of $69 billion to $46 billion last year. Over the last 20 years, China has signed $153 billion worth of loan agreements with African governments, and its trade with Africa is nearly 5 times the volume of US-African trade. And it's not just China. The European Union is implementing economic partnership agreements with 14 African countries. Since Brexit, the UK has signed free trade agreements with numerous African countries, including Kenya. These agreements put US goods, services, and American workers at a significant tariff disadvantage. This week's visit by Secretary Blinken to Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal is most welcome, but American leadership has been absent from the continent for too long. The last Commerce Secretary to visit Africa was Wilbur Ross, who spent 1 day on the continent during his 4 years in office. President Obama was the last American president to visit the continent 6 years ago. In contrast, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has visited Africa 13 times, and French President Macron has made 11 visits. Beijing will convene the 8th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation next week in Dakar, Senegal. Japan, the EU, Russia, Turkey, India, and the UK have all held successive summits designed to deepen commercial ties with African nations. The US has held 1 summit with African leaders, and that was 7 years ago. The United States is ceding the African market to other partners. We have excellent tools in Prosper Africa, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, and many other agencies to help our companies be competitive. What's lacking is a clear and sustained engagement by our most senior officials. There's a lot at stake, not least of which is an emerging free trade area of 1.3 billion people or consumers with a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. While we usually focus on Africa's challenges, this singular view obscures another reality. Africa is a continent of significant opportunity, innovation, and inspiration. Here are several suggestions to reverse our shrinking commercial footprint. The Biden administration should convene a second U.S.-African Leaders Summit in 2022, as well as annual U.S.-Africa business summits. A visit by President Biden to the region would be a significant event. Congress should renew AGOA for another 10 years, well before it expires in 2025. African nations and American companies need certainty about the future of our trade relationship. We should also reconsider the role of conditionalities. Leaders who stage coups and wage war have little concern for the livelihood of their citizens, and Congress can impose effective sanctions to hold them accountable. Using AGOA as a sanction hurts U.S. investors and those on the continent who we want to support. The U.S. should undertake a strategic corridors initiative in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area to expedite the flow of goods along key corridors, such as from Abidjan to Lagos. Finally, we need to resume negotiations with the Kenyan government to achieve a binding and mutually beneficial trade agreement with one of our most important partners on the continent that indeed might become a model for other bilateral agreements. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Recognized. Mr. Whitaker, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the Subcommittee on Trade, I am grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today. I was honored to play a role, however modest, in the great bipartisan movement that was birthed in this subcommittee more than 2 decades ago. It's good to be back where AGOA formally began its journey and where new and even bolder steps must now begin. AGOA has delivered nearly $75 billion in non-oil products to the U.S. duty-free, created millions of jobs, largely for African women, and provided unquantifiable hope for our African people. AGOA has also generated more than 100,000 jobs in the U.S. and turned a U.S. trade deficit with Africa into a trade surplus for non-petroleum products. And all this was done at little or no cost to the U.S. taxpayers. It's heartening to see a new and growing consensus that the time has come to break new ground. So how do we move forward? I will share 3 ideas for now, and I've also submitted one for the written testimony. 1, we should open our tax code to incentivize U.S. investment in and sourcing from Africa. This could include a development tax credit for sourcing products made in Africa under conditions that support workers and the environment, and also the repatriation of profits tax-free on U.S. investments in Africa that promote the green and digital economies or provide access to healthcare. Such a program could also be budget neutral in this time of significant deficits. China has used private sector incentives to grow its trade with Africa 20-fold in the past decade. There is also a precedent for using the tax code to advance our objectives in Africa. My former boss and mentor, the Honorable Charlie Rangel, authored an amendment that effectively doubled U.S. taxes on profits earned in South Africa, hastening the end of apartheid. 2, we should leverage the U.S. bond market to offer bond guarantees to support infrastructure development in Africa. The liquidity of the U.S. bond market is currently on the order of $47 trillion. Such a bond program could also be budget neutral and include incentives for recipient countries to buy American goods and services, thus increasing U.S. export opportunities. 3, we need a targeted approach to AGOA's graduation. Madagascar provides a cogent and sad example of what happens to the most vulnerable people when AGOA's benefits end prematurely. Congress should extend AGOA while graduating sectors after they reach a certain threshold. Similar to a competitive needs limitation, the graduated sectors could then enter into a reciprocal U.S. trade arrangement. This is a time for bold steps. Not one of the world's most pressing challenges can be successfully addressed unless Africa is part of the solution. Not climate change and the destruction of the biosphere, not the threat of ongoing pandemics, not destabilizing mass migrations, nor the cancer of terrorism that feeds on failing states. Africa represents the largest block of votes in international fora, from the UN to the WTO. Now, I believe Africa is leveraging its economic strength in the region to sway Africa's positions in these international bodies. As COVID change and supply chain woes brutally remind us, this is a shrinking interdependent planet. A stable and economically integrated Africa is not a nice to have. It is a must have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, CJ, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the subcommittee. My name is CJ Mahoney. I serve as Deputy General Counsel at Microsoft, and I'm honored to appear this morning on behalf of the company. This hearing is about trade and investment in Africa. I will focus my comments this morning on the second topic. Microsoft has played a key role in Africa's digital transformation over 3 decades. We have made substantial investments on the continent in cloud infrastructure, development centers, and skilling. Microsoft is working hard to bring connectivity to a continent where half of the population still lacks reliable, affordable internet access. Our Airband initiative has 7 active broadband projects serving more than 5 million people. On the sustainability front, Microsoft engineers are working with partners on intelligent water management solutions in Kenya and conservation efforts in Uganda. We are focused on increasing digital literacy and skills. Just this year, Microsoft launched an initiative to teach coding and deep tech skills to 5 million women across Africa by 2030. These experiences have given us a unique vantage point on the many opportunities, but also the challenges that the United States confronts in seeking to deepen trade and investment ties with sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, what we see is that the United States is not well positioned to compete in a region that will be home to 1 in 5 of the world's consumers by 2030. In fact, the U.S. has lost ground in Africa in recent years when it comes to trade and investment. U.S. foreign direct investment flows to Africa have been declining since 2014. Only 6% of Africa's total imports came from the U.S. in 2020, putting the U.S. a distant third in market share behind the EU and China, and just barely ahead of India. So how do we turn this around? We urge the U.S. government to adopt a Trade Plus strategy that pairs use of traditional trade tools like AGOA with initiatives designed to support connectivity, skilling, and the rule of law. The lack of digital connectivity creates a considerable barrier not only to inclusive and sustainable growth in Africa, but also to deeper trade and investment ties with the United States. Closing that divide will make Africa more prosperous and increase demand for U.S. goods and services. Connectivity is not just about internet access, but access to the cloud, which increasingly is a platform not just for storing data, but for delivering software and productivity services that the United States excels in providing. Indeed, cloud infrastructure is becoming, for the 21st century, what interstate highways and flight paths were to the 20th, and what sea lanes and railroads were to the 19th. Although the U.S. cloud sector is thriving globally, Chinese cloud companies are investing far more in Africa than their American counterparts. Over time, these investments could create an enormous advantage for China and diminish U.S. influence in the region. As part of a comprehensive trade and investment framework, we urge the U.S. government to work with African partners to increase connectivity and to ensure level competition for U.S. cloud providers on the continent. In addition to connectivity, digital skilling will be key to providing Africa's growing population with the tools to secure a better future and for driving greater demand for imports of U.S. goods and services. The U.S. government should work with African partners, the U.S. private sector, and NGOs to support increased digital literacy on the continent. Another barrier to U.S. trade and investment in Africa is the persistent problem of corruption. While many African governments have taken steps to root out this problem, more progress is needed. Here again, we believe that technology can play a key role. Microsoft is already working with governments on cloud-based technology solutions that can improve their ability to identify, prevent, and deter corruption. We urge the U.S. government to encourage and assist in these efforts. In closing, as this committee considers the future of AGOA and other initiatives to increase trade and investment between the United States and Africa, Microsoft strongly urges that it proceed in the bipartisan manner that has characterized U.S.-Africa policy for some time. It should also leverage another valuable asset that the United States has in this area, which is a deep bench of seasoned policy experts who know the continent and have dedicated their careers to improving U.S.-Africa ties. That includes my three distinguished co-panelists, the excellent staff of this trade subcommittee, and the dedicated career professionals who staff the Africa office at USTR. I thank the committee for the invitation to testify and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Whitaker, I would just like to thank you for the reminder of the AGOA's significance in the role this committee played. I'm intrigued with your notion of using the tax code in a deficit neutral fashion to provide incentives. Could you elaborate for a moment on how that would be achieved in a deficit neutral fashion?
It would be achieved in and thank you, Mr. Chairman, in a deficit neutral fashion because the investments that we would be incentivizing are not investments that are taking place in Africa now. And so when we look at where the investments are going, we will be incentivizing new investments in the green economy for companies that are coming in, so that we would not be losing any tax resources. It's the same way in which AGOA was practically budget neutral. The tariff relief that we gave to African products were products that were largely not coming in to the U.S. market. They were coming in as a result of the incentives offered by AGOA.
Thank you. Mr. Schneidman, I really appreciated your highlighting the fact that we haven't had a summit for years and your recommendation that it would be time to schedule another one this next year. Could you elaborate for a moment on the role that you see this subcommittee playing to help set the stage for that and perhaps be able to work individually to make a difference?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think your subcommittee could play a critical role in laying the groundwork running up to the summit next year, particularly in broadening the conversation that we're just starting right now. It's so important that we get our partners from the continent involved in this conversation about what kind of future trade relationship, future investment relationship that they want to see. And I think in a robust set of conversations virtually and in person could really broaden out the dialogue. So Africa is not such a mystery to American investors, American government officials, and others. So I think I think the committee has a critical role to play as you take the leadership to think about what a post-AGOA relationship looks like. A post-AGOA relationship matters to Africa. It matters to the United States. So to take that conversation forward under your leadership, I think would be most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to not take up a great deal of time because I want to allow my colleagues to be able to have their moment in the sun. But I'm going to share with each of our witnesses legislation that Senator Schatz and I have introduced to provide greater accountability for products that come from illegally harvested timberland. Having soy, palm oil, cocoa that is produced in areas that have been devastated by illegal harvesting can dramatically impacts our ability to deal with climate change. And our legislation would deny access to the market, discourage access for people who are not accountable for their supply chain. But I know it's easier said than done. So I will send each of you the information and welcome thoughts that you have about the ability to have that accountability for critical supply chains for things like palm oil and cocoa, and welcome observations and thoughts that you might have. And with that, let me turn to our distinguished ranking member, Vern Buchanan.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Africa, when you look at 200 million people, you talk to 63 countries, it just seems we've got to do a lot more and focus a lot more on our focus on the continent. When I think about what China's doing actively everywhere, I had the ambassador from the Congo, and yesterday they were talking about China and stripping all the raw materials out of that country. So it's not just about trade and investment, it's also about national security in my mind. And it just seems like we're on the sidelines, not just in Africa, but around the world. It's not just this administration. I see the last couple of administrations. We need to be doing a lot more focused across the world, but we're talking about Africa today. Ambassador Mahoney, as you look, I know you were very active. I worked closely with you, as many of the members did on the Trade Subcommittee. But what is your thought on Kenya? What did you guys envision there? Why did you pick Kenya out of 63 countries? What do you feel like the opportunity is? And I know you work closely with us on USMCA and a lot of other things as the deputy ambassador. But what's your thoughts on Kenya, in terms of us moving forward aggressively?
Well, Kenya is a very important market for Microsoft. It's one of the two places in Africa where we have a development center. We see it not only as an important market for our goods and services, but as a key source of talent. I should say that Microsoft is all in on a trade engagement with Africa, whether that takes place on a bilateral basis, a plurilateral basis, or with the AU, or some combination of all of the above. I think, though, that there has been a lot of work that's been done with Kenya. We would hope that that work could be built upon. And I think generally, though, when you're thinking about what partners to target in Africa, I mean, you want to think about a couple of different things. Number one, large economies that can have a magnifying effect and are leaders in their region. Kenya is certainly that for the East African community. You want to look at leading economies that have synergies with the U.S., demand for products where we're competitive, like technology. But I think the other thing that's really important is that we really need a willing partner. I mean, there's been reference made to the EU's negotiation of economic partnership agreements in Africa. And I think the sense is that some of that negotiating has been somewhat heavy-handed. I think one of the ways the U.S. can differentiate itself on the continent is to really partner with African countries and do so in a way that's mutually beneficial. And certainly Kenya is a country that has stepped up and is enthusiastic about deepening trade ties with the United States.
Let me ask you also about AGOA. It's going to expire in 3 or 4 years. How can we take our partnership with Africa through AGOA to another level? How do you kind of envision that? Because I know it's something we've talked about in terms of an opportunity down the road. But, I'd like to be thinking about that today, about how we can have a bigger impact building our friendship and our partnership long term.
Well, I think AGOA was a great achievement of this committee, and it's so great to have Rosa Whitaker, who played such an important leadership role in getting that program established. Microsoft is a huge supporter of AGOA. We think it's created a great foundation for deeper trade engagement between the U.S. and the continent. At the same time, as I think there's been acknowledgement already in today's hearing, there's just limits to what a one-way preference program can achieve over the long run. What we would urge the committee to do is to think about, not just the use of traditional trade tools, meaning preference programs or even bilateral FTAs and mutual tariff reduction, but think about other places where the U.S. can use its comparative advantages to really distinguish itself on the continent in ways that will eliminate barriers to trade and drive more investment. And we think that lies in number one, in technology and connectivity, which is a place where the U.S. could meet a real need in Africa. Secondly, on skilling and providing economic opportunities for individuals in businesses. And thirdly, leading with values and helping to promote the rule of law. I think that these are all places where the U.S. can distinguish itself, not only from China, but also from Europe and other major competitors that are on the continent and competing quite vigorously.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Kind.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for teeing up this very important hearing today, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony, your insight, and the advice that you're giving. Ms. Whitaker, let me start with you. Since you were present at the creation of AGOA back in 2000, I'm sure that when those were working on the original AGOA, the vision was much more expansive and hopeful than what the actual results have been, because today we're showing that Africa accounts for about 1% of all U.S. trade and investment. And of that 1%, half of that is just with 3 countries in Africa. So my question to you is, what more can we do to address the utilization rate of AGOA throughout the continent? And secondly, does more need to be done on our front to help build trade capacity with many of these countries, just so that they can get in the game of doing more trade with us, and also in a better position to negotiate potential free trade agreements with us?
Thank you. Thank you very much. In terms of AGOA's utilization, I believe we need a comprehensive approach. What we got in AGOA, we got a trade response, we got an export of product response, but we did not get a U.S. investment response. Because in order to get a U.S. investment response, we need to incentivize our private sector. And as I indicated, there are ways that we can do that that would be budget neutral. In terms of the utilization, that goes into a broader challenge in Africa's capacity. And I do believe that we need to closely examine the effectiveness of USAID. I do not believe that USAID has been very effective. I think $89 billion in 10 years for building capacity. I think USAID is very well equipped to provide humanitarian assistance. That's very different from development assistance. We need a more private sector approach to build that capacity, and we need partnerships. So a combination of incentives for our private sector, training, partnerships between our private sector and the African private sector. That's how you build the utilization.
Well, let me just stay with you on that, because obviously it's intriguing using the tax code to try to incent further investment, further trade and development in Africa. But are you concerned that that would be perceived back home as tax breaks for moving jobs overseas, or for the creation of jobs in Africa as opposed to in our own communities?
No, because I think that we can demonstrate that we would get a job boost, and also we could narrow it to sectors and industries that do not compete with the United States. There's a number. We could start by talking about investments in the green economy. When we look at AGOA, now about 85% of that is oil. So our oil companies are getting a tariff relief, probably one that they don't quite need. We could use that same incentive to incentivize them to move to energy transition and move to more better technologies. So I think it could easily be crafted in a way that it doesn't compete or injure U.S. Industries, and that we have a win on both sides.
We'll hope to follow up with you to flesh that out a little bit more in the future, if it's okay. And Mr. Schneidman, let me ask you, a couple of years ago, I was over in Africa to Cameroon to deal with the Anglophone crisis. But what struck me was, as I was going through the Addis Ababa airport, the number of Chinese diplomats and business people that just flooded the airport alone. And it was striking, because they're there and we're not. Now, you mentioned in your testimony that it's important for us to move forward on an FTA with Kenya, and I would agree with you. But China's Belt and Road Initiative hasn't been warmly received because of problems, especially in Africa. Could you highlight a little bit of the mistakes that they've made with that Belt and Road Initiative that we might be able to learn from ourselves?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Congressman. Look, I think the reality is that China shows up. They are there, and there's no option. We are not there. I mean, just today, there's this amazing road going from Jomo Kenyatta Airport across Nairobi that's going to just move people around. And so African governments don't really have a choice. You know, they have to take these deals. The deals are what we used to do in the 1970s, tied aid, and they come with a lot of debt. But I think what we need to do is to generate the kind of opportunities for American business. So we're investing not just in AGOA related sectors, but in infrastructure too. And that's what I'm hoping this conversation can start. A summit would lead to, annual US Africa business summits would lead to, more aggressive leadership would lead to. As I mentioned in my testimony, we have the tools. Prosper Africa, the US Development Finance Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation does a tremendous amount of investment in Africa in infrastructure, but we're not really mobilizing it effectively. And I think that's what we really need to do better. And I think if we were to do that and to articulate our case, show that it benefits our workers here in the United States, show that it benefits people, average Americans, I think we'd see a lot more support for a deeper US African engagement. And if I may, just for a second, to go to the utilization issue. When Congress renewed AGOA in 2015, it urged African beneficiaries to develop national utilization strategies. Only about half of the 39 countries have done that, but those that have, we've seen dramatic increase in the use of AGOA. Ghana has increased its use of AGOA by 90%. Madagascar has increased its use of AGOA by 390%. And that means these governments are getting down into the weeds in terms of sectors. In Madagascar, it's increased in chocolate, basket weaving materials, apparel. We're starting small today, but if we keep doing this for 4 years and then maybe another 10 years, we can really grow this commercial relationship and attract more US investment. So I think these utilization strategies are extremely important, and we should double down in this area.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you. And it was, I thought, interesting. Ms. Whitaker talked about potentially shifting some of the subsidies in areas like petroleum that may not be needed to green options. I think that's intriguing. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to build off the question that Mr. Kine was pursuing there. Mr. Schneidman, the figures that you quoted are startling, that our bilateral trade's down 40% in the last 10 years, direct investment declined by a third in the last 7 years. We're clearly doing something wrong. I also would amplify your statements earlier about we need clarity in our trade policy. I don't have any understanding of what the Biden administration's trade policy is. Seems to be very haphazard to me. But you said also, Mr. Schneidman, that China and the EU were there and we're not there. Well, according to figures I'm looking at, we pay out about $45 to $50 billion a year in foreign aid, of which 31% goes to these countries. So that would be about $15 billion. Are we not there? $15 billion a year? I mean, could we be targeting some of that aid money more precisely to help with this trade issue?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, you raise a really important point, because if you take that number that I put out, China's $153 billion over 20 years, that comes out to roughly $8 billion, which is pretty much what we're doing in aid every year. Our aid has been transformational in some respects. If you take a program like PEPFAR, 20 million people are alive today on the continent as a result of our aid. I would say PEPFAR has been the most successful aid program since our Marshall Plan that helped build Western Europe. Our aid is important, but we need to move beyond aid, because aid can only take you so far.
What is China doing in aid to Africa?
China's not doing nearly as much in aid as the United States is. I mean, their whole business model has been more mercantilistic. It's been loans to African governments for large infrastructure projects.
Thank you, sir. I have such limited time. I want to turn to Mr. Mahoney and ask really the same question. If we're spending, the figures I'm seeing here, are almost $15 billion a year in aid to Africa, and China's spending far, far less. How can you say that we're not there? I mean, obviously we're investing heavily. Should we be targeting that more effectively to help with this trade issue?
Well, Congressman, I think it's a really important point. I mean, we are there in a lot of ways. We're there in terms of humanitarian aid. The U.S. military does a lot of work on security in the continent, and the PEPFAR program, as Whitney said, has been enormously successful. But I do think that really focus and leaning into where we can be competitive. And Congressman, you've talked a lot about the competitiveness of the United States, and I think as we develop an Africa trade strategy, we really need to think, where can we make a difference? I'm not sure we're going to make a difference in the kind of heavy infrastructure projects where China has played such a role. I think the PEPFAR program is a good example of something that we should try to learn from. And it was enormously successful, but it was also very focused. There was presidential leadership behind it. It was something that set ambitious but quite achievable goals. So I think if you looked at that model and you tried to have a PEPFAR like program, and we would suggest connectivity, skilling, rule of law, those kinds of things paired with traditional trade tools. I think that those are places where we could make a lot of impact, and frankly, just also really distinguish ourselves in our approach from China and other competitors on the continent.
It would seem that our trade with Africa is pretty one-sided in terms of, we have essentially no tariffs coming this way, and our products are heavily tariffed that way. And I guess part of that is to support the development of Africa. How would you change that? Are we holding up trade agreements, or are the African countries? Who's the problem here?
Well, it's complicated. A lot of these, and I think it's also important that we recognize when we talk about Africa, we're talking about 54 individual countries. They are different stages of development. I think as we look forward, and if you want to have stronger and deeper trade ties with these countries, especially as some of these countries are doing reciprocal trade agreements with other developed economies, I think reciprocity is naturally going to be part of the equation. At the same time, some of these countries really are least developed countries, and traditionally we've had a different trade regime for some of those countries, particularly in sensitive sectors. So I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach really makes sense for any of these countries. You have to take account of where they are in their stage of development.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Congressman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank all of our witnesses for sharing their insights with us. Ms. Whitaker, as we begin to focus on reauthorization of AGOA, there are improvements that I think we can make. For instance, more investment in women-owned and small businesses to help them find new markets, and several other issues that we must consider, especially the fact that only 5 countries made up the bulk of AGOA utilization. AGOA aimed to move Saharan African countries from dependency to independence. And I guess we've always thought of trade and not aid. And this has been the case for a handful of countries, but many countries have not maximized to any real capacity the potential that they may have and we may have with them. With reauthorization, we need to focus on deepening the impact, increasing engagement from additional countries, and improving utilization. Let me ask, if I could, what recommendations beyond the discussion that you would have to help us really move in a very significant way? And if the data shows that there are barriers, infrastructure or technical, that prevent countries from participating, can we help them? What can we do to help them be ready and to do business with us?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Let me say, I think you're absolutely right with the how we should empower women-owned businesses. We know that when we make an investment in women, we get phenomenal returns. But the issue is how. I believe that largely our USAID programs have been a colossal failure. And I just don't know why what we have grown is a significant aid industrial complex around Washington. Even the Congressional Research Service looked at this and they couldn't track where that money is going. We don't really have an idea how much is hitting the ground in Africa. So I think that our aid, I support smart aid. I think a lot of US aid has not been smart, particularly from USAID. We get greater results from the Millennium Challenge account approaches. And what Africans have said nearly universally is that we want trade and investment. So how can we make and that's what AGOA delivered. It could do more, but when we look at the return on investment, it is a modest program with a modest expenditure, and it's delivered $75 billion in non-oil products backed up by jobs largely held by women. So what I would say is that I believe we should have a more trade and investment centered approach. We should look at how to make our aid program more effective. I believe we are repeating through aid in Africa what happened in Afghanistan. I spent a lot of time on the ground in Africa and I see it. And I think we need more transparencies from the USAID contractors. I've seen Inspector General reports. They have not. We need to make our aid smart, and we need to take a more trade and investment centered approach. I would just say that no country in the world has transitioned from poverty to prosperity through aid, and Africa cannot either as a region.
Thank you very much. And let me just ask you, Mr. Mahoney, in the 2015 reauthorization, Congress did not require utilization strategies. Do you think that requiring utilization strategies could be a help?
I do think that it could be helpful. I mean, we know the precise format that the strategies take is something we would defer to you and the executive branch on. But I think it's very important that there be plans in place for countries to be able to take advantage of AGOA, as well as the other resources that we've talked about that the U.S. government has. I think that that kind of focus and that kind of structure can be really important in driving impact.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Davis. Congressman Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Just to pick up where my colleague, Mr. Rice, left off with respect to what should Americans expect from the relationship with our African friends and trade partners. In any deal, it's, I think, most appropriate to ask, how is this helping? How is this benefiting? How is this of reciprocal value to the American people? And I'm just using the numbers that have been thrown out. I can't verify, but it sounds like a reasonable analysis to say that we provided $15 billion in foreign aid to African countries. We had this GOA framework that has allowed for African countries to access the United States market with over 6,000 products. My question is, what is the value proposition for the United States? It seems like that should be of primary importance when we're doing deals. And this AGOA framework has been in place for over 20 years now. And so that's a question I guess I would ask to maybe Mr. Mahoney. I'll ask you, Ambassador, good to see you. Thank you for your service. And yeah, I mean, is that a fair expectation? And it seems like we're behind the curve on that one.
Oh, great to see you again, Congressman. I think you're absolutely right in that if you want to have a long-term relationship, at the end of the day, it needs to be mutually beneficial. I think at the same time, we know we have to recognize that these are countries that are at different stages of development. There are sensitive sectors. A lot of these countries, a lot of people work in agriculture, and so demanding that we have full tariff-free access to all these markets tomorrow is probably not a reasonable position to take. But in terms of what are we going to get out of this relationship, I think you have to look at it, it's an important market now, but in 10 and 15 years, this is going to be a hugely important market. I mean, this will be and it'll be a market where there will be a lot of people in the middle class. That'll be a lot of demand for, agriculture products from West Texas, and as well as technology and other products and services that the United States excels in providing. So I think we need to have some. I think we need to be patient, but at the same time, we need a very deliberate strategy to move this relationship forward, because I think that the framework that we have now, I think puts us in a position where we can get to the next level, but it's going to require leadership and creative thinking.
Well, I'm encouraged to note, and the African people should take great hope that 8 of the 10 fastest growing cities in the world and 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies are in the continent of Africa. I think we're way overdue to have some basic expectation for reciprocity, and I think we ought to appropriately leverage the fact that there is. And I understand what you're saying. We can't just expect to have duty-free access to tomorrow, but it's been 20 years. It's not tomorrow, and we've given duty-free access to our markets and to our citizens, and we want that, and I welcome that. So that's a concern of mine. The last question, and I'll just leave it and yield back. It seems like in order to have a robust trade agreement with any country, for America to compete and have benefit, we want to have comparable cost in terms of taxes and regulations. But I haven't seen a single African country raise their taxes to the global minimum. I don't know how many have committed to it, but none have done that. And we're going to now raise taxes on U.S. companies competing with African countries and others for markets in Africa. When we do that, will that affect our ability to get products, American made, to new customers in the African market?
Well, I'll say from Microsoft's perspective, we've been supportive of the framework discussions at the OECD, but clearly the implementation leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and those are things that we're continuing to study and think about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Delpenny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks everyone for joining us today on this important hearing. I appreciate it. I think there has been, strong support for AGOA as a tool to promote development and create jobs in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, our former colleague from Washington State, Congressman McDermott, was the original author and architect of AGOA back in the early 2000s. And while AGOA has been transformational in key African economies and sectors, especially when countries develop comprehensive strategies to take advantage of AGOA benefits, the program's also limited and that only applies to trade in goods and is non-reciprocal, as some folks have brought up. So we should build on AGOA and work to forge reciprocal trade relationships with certain interested African countries to strengthen trade and investment. And these agreements would also be helpful in developing shared standards for the digital economy. This is especially important as we're losing ground to the EU and China in the region. And I've long supported development and poverty alleviation efforts in Africa. My mom served in Africa in the Peace Corps many years ago, but only 22% of the African continent has access to the internet, according to the World Bank. And while that's up from 10% a decade ago, roughly 900 million people are currently without access to the internet. And for those with access, prices remain high and bandwidth remains severely limited in many areas. Ms. Lazier, in your testimony, you discussed that as African countries look to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, they want to develop their digital economies. And that includes significant investment in connectivity, assistance for small African tech startups, and ensuring that African entrepreneurs can compete in a global market. This is the technology and digital trade are also becoming increasingly important in traditional sectors of the economy, such as agriculture and manufacturing. I wondered if you could talk about how the United States can expand digital development efforts across Africa and where we should focus our efforts.
So thank you, Congresswoman. I think that you've touched on, critical issues here. The digital economy is really critical in so many ways because it is supportive of what can happen in other sectors. You look at telehealth, so being able to supply digital there. You look at digital teaching, which the entire world was having to educate our children online. There are areas where obviously being able to use digital, I think CJ mentioned even being able to use it in terms of transparency of transactions on the continent. So yes, there are a lot of US companies that are focused on digital economy. Some of our members of CCA, Google, and others are very active on the continent. Microsoft and others are there. And I think that we're trying to find a balance between what the Africans are looking for in terms of some of their demands to have data centers, for example, in their individual countries, which doesn't make a lot of sense for US companies. We have to look at the data protection aspects, but we also have to look at how to actually partner with Africans to provide the kind of access to digital products and services that their small businesses really need. In fact, some of what they're asking for would make their own companies have to pay more for services that are not as competitive and actually cut them off from the data access that they need. So again, digital is a very important part of this. And again, in areas like telehealth, where we now realize through the pandemic of COVID that we've got to be able to provide services to people who may not be as reachable in person anymore as pre-COVID.
Thank you. And I know we don't have time here, but love further to talk more about how we can use the trade tool AGOA or other agreements, or even build on the African Continental Free Trade Area to look at chapters on digital services. Would love your feedback on that going forward, as well as yours, Mr. Mahoney. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Dobeni. That's important areas, and I think we would all be interested in what you encounter. Mr. LaHood.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing today, and I'm grateful for the witnesses and their valuable testimony today on the opportunities for strengthening the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. It's important. As some of my colleagues have discussed, we need to continue looking at ways to ensure opportunities for robust trade and economic engagement, including permanent and reciprocal trade agreements around the world, particularly on the African continent. While we have had some positive steps, including a framework for the Kenyan FTA and continued engagement on AGOA, I hope we can work together to encourage the Biden administration to end the trade moratorium and engage at a high level with countries on the African continent. Our global competitors, including China, are working to manipulate the U.S.'s reputation and perception on the global stage, including on the African continent, and using every opportunity and investment to their advantage. As China is now the largest single country trading partner in sub-Saharan Africa, I am concerned that continued Chinese investment in trade, infrastructure, and energy will put the U.S. at a strategic disadvantage. My question is for Ambassador Mahoney. What do you think the role of the private sector or public-private partnerships is to help the U.S. better compete and invest in countries, including the African continent?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think the role of the private sector in this equation is absolutely key. And again, if you go back to this, this concept of comparative advantage, the U.S. private sector, I think, is a real asset for the U.S. in trying to deepen ties with these countries, both economic and political. There is a lot of Chinese investment in Africa, but if as I'm sure you and others who have been there and have thought about these issues know, there's also a lot of demand for American investment. One of the things that American companies bring when they invest in places like Africa is a desire to use the local workforce, to train the local workforce in ways that empower people and create opportunities. American companies also bring American values. I mean, the American companies are governed by our laws, by the FCPA. One of the things that Microsoft is proud to have done recently is to join with other cloud companies on something called the Trusted Cloud Principles, where we have come together and said that we're not going to compete in a race to the bottom when people want to use our technology in ways that would reinforce authoritarianism and undermine democratic values. So I think that that's very key. And, when you go back to, PEPFAR is another, as we've talked about, as a successful program, public-private partnerships were an important part of that.
Thank you. And then, Ambassador Mahoney, in terms of your prior work on U.S.-Kenyan negotiations, how can the U.S. be a leader in setting digital trade standards with obviously Kenya and other African nation? And what types of standards would you say are most important to include in the ongoing U.S.-Kenya talks and future U.S.-Africa talks?
Well, Microsoft was a big supporter of USMCA, which, as you know, Congressman, you were very involved in, contains a very high standard digital trade chapter and disciplines on data localization and data flows. I think, though, that it's important that we combine those kinds of demands that the United States would have with also a sort of a more positive and affirmative vision for technology. And, that takes me back to the need that Africans have for connectivity. I think ultimately, the U.S. being involved in investments in connectivity in Africa is something that would benefit those countries. It would also benefit the United States because it would ensure that we are part of that technology ecosystem, and also ensure that Africa's technology ecosystem is built in a way that is consistent with American values and support for democratic institutions.
Well, I agree with you in looking at what we negotiated in USMCA as kind of the standard we ought to look to in future trade agreements. Do you sense there'll be any resistance to what we put in there that currently applies to Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think a lot of countries have, just around the world, not just in Africa, but there are, a number of countries have concerns about where data is stored, particularly sensitive data. And, even in the digital trade chapter that we have in USMCA and in the U.S.-Japan agreement, there are exceptions that allow countries to require localization of certain sensitive data. But I think it's also important that the United States make the case for why overly restrictive policies can really restrict, can limit the ability for individuals and businesses in different countries, particularly in small markets, to have access to the best technology, the best data storage capabilities, the best cybersecurity protections. So I think it's important that we make that case. In addition to recognizing that there are some sensitive areas where we understand that localization of data might make sense for countries and provide some allowance for that.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Beyer. Are you still with us? Congressman Panetta?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this opportunity. May I proceed?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Appreciate this. Thank you very much for having this type of hearing, especially with some of the important issues that obviously our witnesses discussed and what we need to start focusing on a little bit more, I would say, in Congress. So I appreciate you taking this step, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Let me just get right into my questions. Mr. Schneidman, you noted that China has signed more than 1,100 loan agreements worth $153 billion in Africa, and that China's trade with Africa was nearly 5 times that of the U.S.-African trade in 2019. Mr. Schneidman, if you could delve into what countries have developed the closest economic ties with China, and also if you could, what impact has this had on African nations' relationship with China compared to their relationships with other democratic liberal nations?
Thank you, Congressman, for that very important question. I think when you look at where those deals are being struck, it's three sectors principally: power, transportation, and infrastructure. In terms of countries, a number of countries have received the bulk of that: Ethiopia, Angola, Kenya. But I think there's a larger issue, and Afrobarometer just yesterday came out with a poll that they asked broadly across the continent, who do you favor as a development model? And the United States was identified sort of 2-to-1 compared to China. When Afrobarometer conducts its poll and asks Africans, what kind of government do you want to live under? 7 out of 10 will say a democratic government. And I think there's the rub. On the one hand, by us not being more aggressive with our private sector on the continent, African governments have no choice but to go to China to develop the infrastructures, the ports, the railroads, the harbors, the buildings. But really, when it comes to values, it's more, they aspire to the United States. So that's why we have to be more responsive, because that may not be the case in another 10, 15, 20 years ago if we continue to sort of minimize the importance of this market. I mean, here's one example. When the United States normalized relations with China in 1979, nobody could see 30 years down the road that GM would be selling more automobiles in China today than they are in the United States. And I think that same dynamic applies to Africa. This is a really important market with 1.3 billion people, where the median age is 19 years old. There's a lot going on, and we're just not being aggressive in our effort to understand what's going on, to be a partner to what's going on, and to be creative in our own approach.
And thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I completely agree with you. I've had a few trips to Eastern and Western Africa. And the sense that I got from the people I spoke with, and obviously including our American personnel there on the ground, was, they appreciate that China's there, and they appreciate that China is offering up these contracts and this type of investment. But it wasn't just about the values; it was about the product and the quality of the product too. What they said is that based on how bad the product was that they received from China, no matter what it was, that showed them that they weren't in it for the long term.
Right.
To be honest with you, and that the product that they got from the U.S. was substantive, was solid, was secure. And that told them that that's why the U.S. it basically was there for the long term, or that they could rely on the U.S. So just something that I, kept in my mind in my very limited travels in Africa. But that's why traveling to these countries is so important, that you pick up little gems like that.
Absolutely.
And I did. Look, I have 30 seconds left, so I'm just going to yield back my time. Once again, thank you to all of the witnesses, and once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for highlighting such an important issue and such an area in which the U.S. needs to be doing a lot more when it comes to investing in Africa. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Panetta. I couldn't agree more. Mr. Estes, you're up.
Well, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for all our witnesses for being here today. It's also great to have a fellow Kansan in the room, Mr. Mahoney. Thank you, CJ, for being here. It's refreshing today to talk about a topic with bipartisan support, that we have a shared interest in strengthening trade with African nations. Both Republicans and Democrats understand the mutual benefits to expand trade opportunities for job creators and workers, and we've seen the positive effects of free and fair trade, not just in the United States, but everywhere around the world. I mean, I firmly put, all the information and data over the last decades have shown that more people have come out of poverty because of free and fair trade. But we need to move in and get some action and complete some things here. throughout this entire year, a lot of the discussion has been not completing trade tools like TPA so that we can continue the good work on trade that had been started, a lot of it with previous administration, but over the decades with multiple administrations. We talk about AGOA and recognize the mutual benefits of working with countries in Africa, but we need to move forward, and we need to end this moratorium from President Biden on different trade negotiations. As a representative from the air capital of the world and breadbasket of America, Kansans really value free trade and want to open up new markets and get their goods and services out. And our work with Kenya obviously is a good example of how do we utilize some agreements like USMCA as a template for free and fair trade and starting negotiations and move things forward. And so we've got to get the right tools in place, and we've got to be able to move forward. As mentioned earlier, a lot of other countries, some of them adversaries for the United States, have been making inroads in Africa with some less than desirable intentions. And China and Russia in particular have set their sights, and in my opinion, it's to the detriment of not just the United States, but also a lot of the countries in Africa as well. So we need to work to strengthen our trade and moving forward from there. CJ, Mr. LaHood had asked you some questions about digital trade with Kenya and the work that you'd done there. I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to expound upon that related to the trade the negotiations with Kenya and where we were and what can we do next there?
Well, thanks so much, Congressman. Great to see you, and thanks for all the great work that you do for our state. I think as I said before on Kenya, I think it's an enormously important market. I mean, when you look across the continent, it's one of the hubs for technology innovation. As I said previously, if we want to engage in Africa, we want to look for willing partners and partners that are willing to spend the time and the energy necessary to negotiate with us. Sometimes it requires countries in order to really stimulate trade and investment, countries have got to endure reforms, which might be difficult politically. And so, as we look across Africa, I mean, we would urge an approach that takes the entire continent into account. And wouldn't recommend limiting our engagement to any particular country, but Kenya is a very key market, and given their willingness to engage, we would hope that there would be continued progress in that relationship. And I do think that digital trade is a place where in countries like Kenya, we can have agreements, and ideally agreements paired with investments that can be mutually beneficial. It can help to close the digital divide in these countries, but also to create additional demand for U.S. goods and services.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's so important that Kenya is a good starting point, and we need to move forward with. There's so many more countries within the continent that we can work with. I know, my hometown of Wichita has developed some relationships with Ghana over the years, and obviously that's one of those countries that we also need to move forward with. But there's a lot of other countries that we should be working with as well. So I do have 30 seconds left, but I instead of asking another question, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Congressman Beyer.
Thank you, Chairman, very much for holding this hearing. Really interesting. I have a question for Mr. Schneidman. Mr. Schneidman, on November 2nd, the President provided Congress advance notice of his intent to terminate designation of Ethiopia as an AGOA beneficiary due to the human rights concerns. And this has been very controversial, especially in my district where you and I both live. To date, no other countries removed trade preferences for Ethiopia. The European Union has a program similar to it, but they have not suspended the trade preferences. You suggested that we conduct a thorough review of how these AGOA conditionalities are structured. We got powerful tools like sanctions to hold those accountable for human rights abuses or staging a coup. But as you pointed out, when we used the sanctions in 2009 in Madagascar, instead of withdrawing AGOA benefits, many of the 50,000 workers, mainly women, who had nothing to do with the coup lost their jobs. We have a similar situation in Ethiopia. Maybe 100,000 workers in the southern part of the country, again, mainly women, employed in AGOA-dependent jobs and have nothing to do with the conflict with the Tigrays or Eritrea, are likely to lose their jobs. I just would love to hear your views on this topic and what advice we should be giving the White House and the State Department as we move forward.
Congressman, good to see you. And thank you so much, number one, for everything you do for our district and also for the question. As I mentioned in my testimony, I think the issue of conditionalities really needs to be reviewed carefully. When AGOA was passed in 2000, it was seen as incentivizing good governance. And that was probably relevant at that time. And it was part of building a broad constituency of stakeholders from civil societies, from churches, from all across America in support of this new approach toward Africa. But I would posit we're in a different situation today. As you mentioned, when there was a coup in Madagascar in 2009, it wasn't the people who staged the coup who were held accountable. It was the 50,000, mostly women, who lost their jobs. It took Madagascar 7 years to get back to the level of exports. And we're facing a similar situation today in Ethiopia, where Congress has passed legislation, the administration is threatening sanctions. There are many tools to hold those who are responsible for the conflict accountable. But if we kick Ethiopia out of AGOA, if we withdraw the benefits, some 100,000 workers, mostly in the southern part of the country, in Hawassa, could lose their jobs. Those are people we want to be working with, that we want to support. And there's a second dimension. U.S. companies have invested in Ethiopia precisely to take advantage of AGOA benefits. They're invested in the southern part of the country. So we're hurting U.S. companies as well. We're not being a reliable partner. So it's a very different situation. And that's why I think we have to review the conditionalities.
Whitney, thank you very much. I only have a little time, so let me move on. Ms. Flory Leiser, I hope I'm doing the right name, right?
It's fine.
When Chairman Blumenauer and I were in Glasgow last week, we met with sub-Saharan African farmers, small subsistence farmers, part of the fair trade movement, and wanted to make sure that as we were doing climate language, that we remembered that the fair trade implications on the small farmers. What advice can you give us? What can we make actionable on ways and means to help those farmers?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, for that question. What you're touching on is an important issue right now in terms of the state of Africa as it relates to climate change. They are small contributors to global warming, but they are being impacted in tremendous ways by global warming. It's affecting farmers where they see droughts where they never saw them before. They experience floods where they never had before. I think that as the U.S. and others are looking at how to address climate change, they do need to take into account that Africa is a small contributor. Africa still is a continent that needs energy. They are energy deficient, and they have resources which need to be used carefully and in ways that don't contribute to climate change. But for example, if the U.S. joins with others, which I believe it has, in saying that we won't invest in the development of gas in Africa, then essentially we are condemning Africa to a place where they won't be able to provide energy to their citizens. The farmers that you talk to will be impacted by climate change. Using gas could be a transition from petroleum and other coal, et cetera, to cleaner energy, solar, hydro, all of which they could contribute to, but they still need gas in that transitional period. So I do think that this issue of balancing what we're trying to do in the climate area with looking at Africa as a continent that still is, poor, still needs a lot of economic development, and not condemning them to stay in that position based on the goals that we have for climate change. I think they do support climate change. I think they will contribute to that. But I think that we have to be very careful about the policies that we put in place that could in fact impact them negatively in many, many ways beyond just climate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Of course, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Beyer. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, are you muted? Drew, not hearing you. Dr. Ferguson, I'm not hearing you. Are you unmuted?
Hey, Chairman, sorry, I was trying to get everything working here. So I'm okay if you can hear me now.
We can. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And a couple of questions on here. And Mr. Mahoney, I'll start with you. Looking at some of the issues around around Huawei and sort of a competitive disadvantage that's been created there due to Chinese activities. Can you talk a little bit about what the major barriers are to companies like Microsoft and others as it relates to cloud computing on the continent, and what do you think should be done to make sure that U.S. companies are able to compete fairly on the continent?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Congressman. As I noted in my written testimony, we're seeing a lot of investment from Chinese cloud companies in Africa. I think Huawei has done something like 70 deals in over 41 countries. And if you just look at the map of where Chinese cloud companies are versus U.S. companies have invested in 3 countries so far, and you see Chinese companies investing in over a dozen. I think it was really a kind of a question of focus. This has been an area where China, with the support of the Chinese government, incidentally, is really focused in expanding its cloud network. So I think what is needed in order to turn this around is a U.S. strategy to expand our own presence in the cloud computing market in this area. I think U.S. companies have a lot. We have the technology. We have a lot of capital. I think what would help, though, would be a partnership with the federal government to look at markets, look where we can be competitive. Support from the commercial service, from U.S. embassies. There could probably also be some role for the DFC and other U.S. development agencies to provide capital for some projects. One of the things we're also seeing is that a lot of the investment that the Chinese are putting into this area is in the public sector, which is something that is concerning because the public sector is oftentimes the first sector that goes to the cloud, and then the private sector can follow. So I think this is a key part of the technology ecosystem in Africa, and if we want to be relevant there in the future, it's something that needs to be a focus, not only for companies like Microsoft, but for the U.S. government as well.
All right, a quick follow-up question on that. You mentioned U.S. embassies in Africa. Do we have a security issue here with U.S. embassies having to use infrastructure in a given country that's owned, that's been put in by Huawei? I mean, how do we get around that, or do we have a national security problem when we have to operate on their networks, or are we operating? I just don't know how that works. Or do we have closed networks that we don't have to deal with? Or what about American companies that are having to operate there? Are they less secure because they're operating on Chinese networks?
Well, Congressman, I'd have to defer to others that have more expertise in the security aspect of this. But what I will say is I think that if the U.S. is going to maintain relevance in this market, we need to be part of the technology ecosystem. Being part of the technology ecosystem means at least having some role in the digital infrastructure. And cloud increasingly is a critical component of that. So I think security concerns are obviously important, but I think as you look at this market in 10 to 15 years, we just also have to think about where is our place in the market, and are we making the kinds of investments now to ensure that we can succeed in the future.
Okay, one final question here. Looking at where the UK, the European Union, and China, where they have developed agreements, they've kind of made it where the U.S.'s share of the marketplace in Africa is much smaller. Can you quickly comment on the economic implications of that, and maybe what you see coming down the road because of that?
Well, I think you're right to highlight that issue, Congressman. Is currently the U.S. is number 3 in as a share of Africa's imports, and just barely ahead of India. And it's hard to think that that's not to some large extent a consequence of the fact that Europe, China, India, and even Turkey have had really focused, aggressive strategies regarding trade in Africa, and it's resulted in agreements, it's resulted in deals and contracts, and just an overall larger commercial footprint. So if we want to compete with that, we've got to be engaged. Or I think that the trend that we've seen in terms of declining foreign direct investment and declining volumes of trade will continue.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the conversation about the cloud and the security implications. And CJ, if somebody has some information on that, I think we'd all be interested. Congresswoman Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan. And thank you all to our witnesses who are here today. I'm so glad to see that there is such strong bipartisan support for engaging with Africa. I think we have a timely opportunity to build upon the successes of AGOA as we then move forward towards its reauthorization in 2025. With that timeline before us, Congress must also continue to move quickly to reauthorize important programs like TPA to ensure that we can continue to engage strategically with this very important continent. I remain concerned about China's growing investment throughout Africa. The Chinese state-owned enterprises play such an outsized role in Africa's energy and transportation sectors. And according to London School of Economics, 1/3 of Africa's power grid has been financed and built by Chinese SOEs. To me, this is very concerning. China is not acting altruistically. Instead, China's using Africa's resources to grow their own economy and influence throughout the world. We are at such a pivotal juncture to continue to grow our investment and trade with Africa. The United States can help these countries grow their own economies and pull people out of poverty and provide key resources like energy as those countries start to power up. Mr. Schneidman, in your testimony, you state that China has signed more than 1,100 loan agreements worth $153 billion that are largely focused on 3 sectors: transportation, mining, and power. How can the United States view this as an opportunity to increase our trade and investment in Africa?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. there are still many roads to be built in Africa. There are many ports to be developed. There are many airports still to be developed. There's an infrastructure gap of about $100 billion per year in Africa. That's a huge opportunity for us. But our companies tend to see Africa as a continent where there's great risk. And this is why it's so important that our government, that the Biden administration, as previous administrations did, work with our private sector together to help reduce that risk. And when the DFC invests in a project, even a small amount, that unlocks a lot of private sector investment. And that's why I'm calling for a summit. That's why I'm calling for annual US business summits. So we can get our private sector together with our government leaders of our government agencies, with our counterparts from the continent, to start addressing some of those critical infrastructure investments, those critical power investments, critical technology investments that need to be made. Just one example of the opportunity: Africa's e-commerce is projected to grow from $8 billion in 2017 to $46 billion in 2025. That's growth of 575%. We need to be there. Our technology companies are already on the continent, but it's time to scale up. And I think working with the Biden administration, we can seize these opportunities and start bringing American businesses more central to the equation.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to turn to nuclear energy because it holds promises for Africa as it provides reliable and clean energy. How could the U.S. support its deployment to Africa to help support their people and their economies?
That's a good question. And to be honest with you, I don't have great expertise in the area of nuclear energy. I have talked with some companies that have looked for opportunities. I'm aware that South Africa has looked utilizes nuclear energy, but previous administrations, our Department of Energy has worked with their counterparts on the continent, and I think
that kind of leads into, energy technology exports and our ability to help them with national security. And so, what trade tools could the United States use to combat the Chinese forces and then go ahead and export our energy and technology to them?
Well, our U.S. Export-Import Bank is ready to go. It's fully authorized. They've supported major energy projects in the LNG sector in Mozambique. U.S. Development Finance Corporation, it's a new $60 billion agency that's prepared to make equity investments. And I think, as I said, we have the tools. We just have to identify the opportunities and lower the risk for our companies. And if we can do that, I'm sure we can start reversing the trend line and make it a positive one instead of the current negative one that it is.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Congressman Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I proudly attended the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA Forum in Ivory Coast in 2019. I participated in the virtual event with the chairman this year. I was happy to see that AGOA was beneficial to many African communities and helped lift them out of poverty. But I understand there have been challenges and the impact has been wide range as it hoped. With the upcoming expiration of AGOA, it is important to analyze the outcome of this trade agreement. So, Ms. Whitaker, as an architect of AGOA, what have you seen from AGOA that has worked and not worked?
Thank you, Congressman. I look at it in terms of a return on investment. So I think what has worked is that AGOA has helped to diversify U.S.-African trade. The share of oil has decreased in that trade relationship, and we now seeing, as I mentioned, $75 billion in non-oil products come in duty-free. That's backed up by jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. I think it's also important to look at what has AGOA done for the United States. For the United States, AGOA has helped to also expand our market share in Africa. We often talk about what AGOA has done for Africa, but we also have grown our market share in Africa, and I believe is as a result of this partnership. So the greatest benefit of AGOA has been with, I think, those apparel jobs that's largely been held by women, the car assembly, and so I don't think we can underestimate that, especially when we look at what costs. There's been a lot of discussions about China, and I would just say what the Africans have told me. They often repeat an American song. If you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. So what I'm saying about AGOA is that it was modest, and now we need to build on what's working, because we have evidence that if you look at what we invested at AGOA and the outcomes of AGOA, we have a strong return on a U.S. investment.
So I'm going to follow up with you. What provisions of AGOA are important to keep when negotiating further bilateral agreement with countries in Africa?
Well, I think that AGOA has a cumulative rule of origin. I think that is very important, where in the rule of origin, they can include inputs from other African countries. I think that's very much aligned with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that is also important that we keep the broad market access and to be very thoughtful about how we move to the path of reciprocity, how we graduate sectors, and how we do it with the least amount of damage. I also think that it's important that we keep, the president should have discretionary authority as we do this, but we also need to build in some permanency. I believe that what's happening in Ethiopia, the announcement of taking AGOA away from women that are largely the poorest women in the world, taking away their jobs and their incomes because of a conflict, which they are the greatest victims. I think that kind of uncertainty does not help us with AGOA. We need to build in better certainty and a longer time frame.
Mr. Schneidman, do you agree or have anything to add?
I certainly agree with what Rosa Whitaker just said. I think in terms of what we should keep with AGOA is really working with the LDCs, the least developed countries. I think they stand to benefit the most, and I think working with national AGOA utilization strategies, we can accomplish a great deal. But I also think we need to move to more mature trade relationship, and I think what the last administration started with Kenya, really, we need to move forward there, because what we're seeing is that there's some countries on the continent where our products going into the market face an 18% tariff. That same product coming from the EU faces a 4% tariff. That discriminates against American workers, and I think we need to redress that. And the way to redress that is moving toward reciprocity with those economies on the continent that are ready to move there. And Kenya is certainly at the top of the list, but not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership and giving me the opportunity to participate in this very important subject on Africa and the continent. I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, I deeply appreciate your leadership and engagement and joining us for this hearing, and look forward to working in the future. Mr. Smith, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panel. This is very timely. Obviously, I'm excited that we can have this type of engagement. I just think it's a unifying issue. Certainly the expertise on our panel here, I'm grateful for your participation. Traveling my district recently, I got to visit a specialty coffee auction. It's called Zabuni Specialty Coffee. that is this coffee auction that actually, as pointed out before, we know that trade agreements need to be mutually beneficial. And so it's exciting to see when a business in rural Nebraska, as I represent, can, have a place in the world, especially as commerce is related, where this coffee auction can actually make sure that growers in Africa get a greater share of the price paid that a lot of folks across America are willing to pay. And so I just think that any trade agreements that can reduce the trade barriers, that's great for businesses here, but that's great for growers in Kenya too, and across Africa. So I'm anxious to see things proceed here. I do have concerns that perhaps the EU, with their very protectionist agriculture policies, not based on science, I might add, and then obviously China, as has been mentioned several times, moves the goalpost and so forth. That they're setting the stage, and I'm just wondering what we can do right now to prevent these two entities, the EU and China, from getting their foot in the door that would reduce the opportunity that we might be able to experience. So if all of you would want to answer, hopefully briefly in the limited amount of time, Ms. Lisar, if you want to start.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. I think the key here is that since the beginning of AGOA, that was in 2000, things have changed. Things have changed in Africa. Things have changed in the global economy. And what we need to do now is to take account of the kinds of changes that have happened and to not rely on simply one tool, one platform, AGOA, to expand the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. It doesn't make sense 2 decades later to do the same exact thing and expect different results, right? So we've got to go beyond AGOA. We have to recognize, for example, that trade and services is actually more of a contributor to African GDP and to U.S. GDP than goods trade. So for both of the economies, both the U.S. and our African partners under AGOA, we have to be looking at how do we support services trade in critical areas, logistics trade, distribution, education services, technology and digital services. These are all things that are really critical. And so we can't just look at one tool. I agree with Whitney that we've got to look at champions across the continent. Kenya would certainly be one, but there are others as well. Ghana, South Africa. We started a trade agreement negotiations with South Africa and the 4 Southern African Customs Union countries, SACU, back in 2003. And we ended it in 2006 when we extended AGOA. Then essentially what the South Africans said was, why should we negotiate with you for continued access to the US market when we can in fact get it from AGOA and not have to give you anything for it? We do need to level the playing field for US companies in Africa. And that means that we put US companies that produce goods that compete more with European products than with Chinese products so that they can have equal access to the African market, which all of us recognize is a growing market, huge demand there, growing middle class, a youth-driven economy that values US products and US services. So I think that's important. The last thing that I would say is that we need to look at how we can utilize US government tools like Prosper Africa, DFC, the US Trade and Development Agency, MCC, Exim Bank. This is really important, and how we then incentivize the US private sector. Those are the key things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My time has expired, but I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate the line of inquiry. It's Very, very important. Congressman Gomez, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for being here. First, let me just state that I know that AGOA has served as the best line for economic relationships with our African trading partners, bolstering economic growth, promoting political and economic reform, advancing regional integration, and improving U.S. relationship with sub-Saharan Africa. However, only a few countries fully utilize AGOA, and the program has many limitations. But I think we can build on the success of AGOA and further fostering trade and investment ties with sub-Saharan African countries. I thought Miss Whitaker, I think she's still on.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
I know you have a lot of experience with in this region. How can stronger trade and investment ties between the U.S. and sub-Saharan Africa deliver equitable, inclusive prosperity to all communities and households?
Well, I think that those are objectives that we can certainly build into any incentives that we include in AGOA. And those are objectives. So, or any trade arrangement we have with Africa. I think what is really needed is a comprehensive U.S. trade approach to Africa. For example, some sectors are more important to us than others. Right now, one of the areas of greatest strength for American exporters is really electrical vehicles. So when we look at the promise of electrical vehicles, we're looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo with 70% of the world's cobalt, and in DRC, but 60% of that is processed in China. And so when we look at that as a sector, I think we have to build a strategy around that. I mean, there's work going on that's looking at manganese as an alternative to cobalt and lithium batteries. We have a tremendous interest in that because it's tied to our exports. We should be very concerned about the fact that more than 30% of the world's strategic resources that we need for our cell phones, for our own industrial, for our infrastructure, will literally be controlled by China. So to that extent, I would say let's incentivize our private sector, let's leverage every tool, and let's move away from the approach we currently have of discouraging U.S. investments in Africa, and see how the government, the Congress, and administration can play a catalytic role in increasing this investment and trade.
And you kind of led into my next question. I noticed that in your testimony, you mentioned 90% of AGOA exports throughout the existence of the program have been oil products. And you're mentioning some opportunities, but how can Congress amend the tax code, because we are also a tax committee, to stimulate investments in the clean energy and green job creation in sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh, I think that's one of the features of the new approach that would really work, and it wouldn't be that difficult. First of all, if you did that, I mean, maybe even as a part of another instrument, you could say for U.S. companies that invest in green energy or energy transition, we will give you a development credit. So we're not really losing money because this is investments that really are not there. And as a part of that development credit, you have to also be inclusive of women and of vulnerable enterprises, and maybe include partnerships. So we can do that, and it would be budget neutral, because basically AGOA has largely been budget neutral because we incentivize a lot of trade that otherwise would not have existed. And so that's how we could do it, especially when I look at the centrality, for example, of manganese and to electrical vehicles as a replacement for cobalt. We got to look at where is U.S. interest, where's our greatest strength. I agree with Flory. We know the services sector is our greatest strength. So we can do a lot there to incentivize, even if we say for new investments, the U.S. companies can repatriate the taxes from those the profits, tax-free. That would move U.S. investments. Even if we reduced it, from the overall worldwide tax rate, which I think is like 27% now. Even if this is what moves the private sector. China has done it. There's a history of enterprise zones with bipartisan support. We know that would work. That will work for Africa, and I think it would work better than anything that we could possibly be doing now.
Thank you. And my time is up, but I definitely support and reauthorizing ago when it expires, but also making some improvements on it. I know we have a number of years before we get there, and having this discussion now is going to help set the baseline for understanding within Congress. Also, I see CJ Mahoney, who was with USTR. Good to see you, CJ, and we look forward to having this conversation as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Gomez. Let me just say, Ms. Whitaker, I'm intrigued. As I said, I hope that you will provide some analysis when we're actually giving a tax credit, giving money to corporations. I want to understand how this is deficit neutral, because I think it is an intriguing concept. And I'm just a little slow to understand the permutations. I see this different than the preferences that we've given, and I'd like to explore it. I think we have covered every witness, rather every member. We'd like to thank you for your patience sticking with us on a long hearing today, and for your long time work on the trade relationship with Africa. Today's hearing demonstrated the importance of this relationship and gave picture of other areas that we can explore, some of the shortcomings of what we're doing now, opportunities to meet the challenge of some of our competitors around the globe, and most important, to be able to help Africa develop. I'm confident we will advance and think creatively about our next chapter in trade policy with the African continent with your help. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made a formal part of the hearing record. And with that, the Trade Subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.